I'm Leslie Francis. I'm delighted to welcome all of you here to this edition of our colloquium in Law and Biomedical Sciences. Today, we are joined by someone I've known for several years from Law and Society meetings, and I think maybe ALS meetings too. He's Doran Dorfman, Associate Professor of Law at Syracuse Law School.
Marcus Rashford's been outspoken on that topic here in the past.
Okay. He works on the intersection between issues in health law and issues in disability law, uses social science research to explore issues of stigma. He's published, among other places, the Law and Society Review, which is a review that features a lot of really good empirical work in law, the Illinois Law Review, Law and Social Inquiry, the University of California at Irvine Law Review, and the Journal of Law and Biosciences. He received the equivalent of a JD, that is an LLB, and an LLM from the University of Haifa in Israel, then later a JSM and a JSD from Stanford Law School. He's been a litigator in Israel and was also actively involved in NGOs such as Kav La'oved Workers Hotline, giving legal advice to disadvantaged workers and asylum seekers. And I'm sure he can correct my pronunciation there. But without further ado, Professor Dorfman, take it away.
Hello, hi everyone, and thank you so much, Professor Francis. It's so nice to be here and see so many people taking the time to come. I really appreciate it, and I'm very, very excited. Yeah, thank you for having me. I want to talk a little bit about my work and my approach to legal scholarship, which I think is a little different than what you might have seen or might not have seen before. And then I want to talk a little bit more about this project as well, if that's okay. I'll share a PowerPoint in a few minutes. So, as Professor Francis said, I am a legal scholar that really uses a lot of methodology that is associated with law and psychology type of research, psychology and a little bit of sociology, a little bit of political science type of research. And I'm interested in broad questions of trust and legitimacy in legal institutions, and how trust really is imposed by a legal institution, and how it is being eroded. And I think that became a hot topic during the pandemic recently. There's actually some issues of that in this particular paper that I kind of want to highlight. And I'm also very interested in relationship between people and compliance with the law. I usually have mixed methods type of research, so I use both quantitative and qualitative type of research methodology. Although this paper is mostly quantitative, it does have some qualitative elements to it, and if you took a look at the paper, you could see it in the comments that I insert from the respondents. And I think what's really interesting and great and kind of I think beneficial about my scholarship is that it does back up what I say with some data. But at the same time, it's very important for me to speak to a large audience. So I don't want my papers to only speak with people who do like, so quote unquote, law and economics type of work, right? Who run regressions, right? Just like I do. And I kind of try to reach out to a broader audience. And my goal is that, like this paper, hopefully people who do law and economics and people who do queer theory would be interested in this paper together, right? And we can sit at the same table and talk with each other. I don't think, and that's something that I, hope to bring to the table. So my new paper is called The PrEP Penalty. It's actually a new paper that I'm submitting this cycle, so it's really exciting, I think. And this paper came to life 4 years ago in 2017 when I was a doctorate student. And I belong to this lab at Stanford University, where I conducted other works of mine that also deals with topics of trust, but in disability law. And it really came to me that there is so much contradiction in the way we look at LGBTQ people and LGBTQ health. And there is some contradictions and a lot of like narratives that really collide with each other. And that really made me think. And in 2017, I ran the first rendition of the experiment that I'm presenting here. I later redid the experiment, and I'll talk a little bit about the differences between the 2017 and 2019 version. And the 2019 version is the version that I'm presenting, is the findings that I present here. So let me start by talking a little bit about what is PrEP. So PrEP is an anti-HIV medication. Its PrEP stands for pre-exposure prophylaxis, meaning that it is a drug that a person takes in order to stay HIV negative. It's not the cocktail that people who are, it's previously known as the cocktail that people who are HIV positive take to, reduce the risk of them transmitting HIV. It's for HIV negative people, so they won't get HIV, and that's very, very important thing to say. It is taken once a day, and it's becoming increasingly popular. It's also very, very effective. It's 99% effective. As some of you know, the ACA actually covers preventative health measures. It's one of the goals of the Affordable Care Act of the ACA to cover and actually make sure that people, have wellness and health, and not only taking care of conditions that already occurred, but also preventing some conditions. And PrEP is actually covered under the Affordable Care Act. Not only that, it was approved by the FDA in 2012 as a prophylaxis, as a preventative drug. Right before that, it was used for people who are HIV positive, but as PrEP, as a preventive measure, it was approved in 2012. The CDC recommends and endorses the use of PrEP, and the Department of Health and Human Services has this whole plan of eradicating HIV in the US by 2030 using PrEP. So we can see that on the one hand, we have all this push towards, having more and more people using PrEP and actually fight HIV transmission, which I think is a great idea, right? On the other hand, we have another policy at hand that does not talk specifically about PrEP, but actually, I argue, penalizes people who take PrEP. So that's kind of like, a contradicting narrative. And that narrative and that policy is the FDA's blood ban for gay men and bisexual men, MSM. MSM are people who are men who have sex with other men. And that include a bisexual men and gay men. The FDA blood ban or the FDA deferral policy for MSM, that's the original and like the formal name for this policy, has come about in the 1980s as a response to the AIDS epidemic, obviously. And however, after many, many years after that, like decades after that, it did stay intact, although it did go through some changes, which I'm going to talk about in a sec. So the idea is that people who so the original policy and the idea was that men who have sex with men have more of risk of getting HIV, and therefore they should be not allowed to give blood, to donate blood, right? In 2015, after decades, almost 2 decades, this policy changed for the first time, and it allowed MSM to donate blood if they sign a waiver and testify that they did not have a sex with another man for the year prior to the donation. So we had a 1-year deferral. You have to be abstinent for 1 year. if you were a gay or bisexual man, in order to be able to give blood. During the pandemic, because of unprecedented blood scarcity, this policy was changed again. And the deferral period that used to be 12 months was changed to 3 months. And that was changed following some push by Democratic senators that pushed for this change. But it is still a policy that a lot of people argue, a lot of scholars argue, there's a lot of scholarship about this, is unconstitutional, is stigmatizing, and it really should not be in place. And the reason it should not be in place is because there was no known incident of HIV transmission or some kind of an STI transmission through a blood transfusion in the last 3 decades. There was no one incident of that happening. Furthermore, every blood donation that is being donated in blood banks is being checked, is being tested to see if there is some kind of an STI. STI is a sexually transmitted infection like STDs, right? It's the same acronym, or HIV. So every type of donation, regardless if it was given from an MSN or somebody else, is being tested. And still, we still have that policy in place. And that policy has, as I said, has been written, like a lot of people have written about it. It's fascinated people for many, many, many years. But what really occurred to me is that, well, didn't I tell you like a slide ago or like a few minutes ago that we kind of almost eradicated this idea about HIV infection using PrEP? How come nobody puts 2 and 2 together and like uses the idea of PrEP with the blood donation? If a person who takes PrEP is probably never going to get HIV, why can't he be an exception to this policy, to this legal policy? Why can't they donate blood? And by surprise, nobody has actually even written or thought about it. And my idea was that was a big issue that actually could help the public health efforts to have more blood donation given. I also want to say something more about PrEP that I didn't mention. Every person who takes PrEP is actually a person who is being tested every 3 months for STIs and HIV. So people who take PrEP, this is like a prerequisite to get your prescription. And people who are on PrEP are actually people who are making the responsible choice, right? Because they always know their status, right? And they're the people who actually know for sure that they're not HIV positive or they don't have STIs. So that's actually, very good news. And then what I actually am seeing is that the law, on the one hand, really endorses the use of PrEP, but on the other hand, it penalizes people who are on PrEP because currently people who are on PrEP are not able to donate blood because it indicates that there are men who have sex with men. Most of the people who use PrEP are gay men. So there is a contradiction here, and there is a paradox, and I call it the paradoxical legal treatment of PrEP by the law. So that's one topic, or actually 2 topics that I brought together. But then to complicate things even more, I want to talk a little bit about one of the most important or well-noted developments with regard to LGBTQ rights, and that's the recognition of gay marriage and gay families. If we start with gay marriage, I hope you recognize this photo on the screen. This is Mr. Ratburn from the kids show Arthur, which is very popular everywhere. When there's a famous episode that came up in 2019 where Mr. Ratburn, who's the teacher for Arthur and his other kid friends, actually is getting married to a guy. His students never knew he was gay, and they are a little surprised, but actually very, very happy for him. This episode had some meaningful influence on me too, because when it aired in Israel, my dad gave me a really quick phone call to let me know all about it and how excited he was for this development. However, many other people were very much less excited about it. This episode was not allowed to air in Alabama, for example. So I was really interested in how developments in the legal recognition of gay marriage influence this idea about, deservingness to give blood, and how they correspond with this idea about PrEP. And then I didn't want to stop there. I also thought that today we have more and more recognition of gay families in general. And this idea about parenthood and LGBTQ parenthood is a really important thing that really surfaces and really, I think, touches a lot of people's lives nowadays. We see a lot more visibility of it. And we even see a new trend of people who actually are becoming gay single fathers through surrogacy, which is another issue that I'll come back a little bit later in the talk. And I thought to myself, wow, those are three interesting topics, three really cutting edge topics with regard to LGBTQ rights and health. How do they correspond together? How do they go together? And I thought to myself, well, let's do an experiment. Let's have an experiment where we actually test how perceptions of the public really are influenced by PrEP and by gay family status, and how do they affect the way people see and trust and comply with the legal policy, the blood ban itself. So what I did is that I designed a survey experiment, which is a 2 by 4.5. So there will be two independent variables, two variables or two factors that I want to test how they influence people's ideas about the blood ban. Okay, I'll explain this a little bit better with this slide. So the two independent variables here are whether a patient or a potential donor, potential blood donor, is taking PrEP or not taking PrEP. And I called my potential donor Jim. I made him a gay man, so it will be very, very clear that he's an MSM. He's a man who have sex with men. And I made him either being on PrEP or not being on PrEP. I think someone, like I hear all these noises, someone can maybe make sure that they're muted. Sorry. So one condition is being on PrEP or not being on PrEP, right? And we can see those in those two columns, right? The other independent variable, the other factor that I wanted to see with regard to the deservingness of the person to be able to give blood is their familial status. So we have Jim being a single gay man, a single parent, being married, or being a married parent. Okay, so we have 4 conditions regarding family status, and we have 2 conditions with regard to PrEP. Put it together, we can see that we have 8 conditions here about the identity of Jim as a potential donor. However, when I ran it with the lab that I belong to, it's called, by the way, I want to give credit. It's the Lab for the Study of American Values at Stanford University. When I ran it there, a lot of people really wanted me to put a straight condition. A lot of people really pushed me, and those were a lot of people from political science who really, really wanted to see a straight condition. And because this is already an experiment with a lot of conditions in it, I did add a straight condition, but my straight condition was a straight man on PrEP, where I don't reveal his familial status. Okay, so we have a straight person who's on PrEP, we don't have his familial status, and that's a 9th condition. Okay, we'll call it the straight condition. Okay, and after I present a vignette, after I present a story about this potential donor to my participants, I want to ask him 2 questions. Now that you know of this person, and I'm going to also tell you that this person is a universal donor, meaning he can donate blood and his blood type can be compatible with any other blood type. So it's very valuable. right? And I will tell you that the FDA is actually checking every blood donation, right? After telling you all of that and telling you about the blood ban, I want to ask you, what is your willingness to accept blood from this person, and whether you would support changing the policy on a structural level? I am still a law professor after all, right? And lifting the blood ban. How, and those are the two questions that serve as the dependent variable. This is what I'm measuring, okay? And I'll show you exactly how I actually executed those in my experiment in a minute. But I just want to make sure that everybody's with me. If somebody has a question about this, please unmute yourself and ask me now, because I kind of want to make sure. Okay, great. Yeah, Shuba, do you have a question? Professor Gold?
I was just wondering about Jim is straight as opposed to Jim. I mean, is the default, maybe I missed it, default is Jim is gay?
Yes, the default is Zim is always gay. Yeah, Zim is always gay, and it's only one condition is straight. So we have 9 conditions. Those are randomly assigned to individuals. That's very important to say. This is an experiment. So one important characteristic of this is to randomly assign those 2 people and see, and then compare those.
My question is for the political, the people who are urging you to put Jim as straight. Why not also Jim is bisexual?
I could put a lot of those, and I could I could put Jim as straight a parent, as a straight married person, as a straight married parent, etc. It's just a matter of how many conditions I could have and how many people I will need in my sample. Okay, so there could be endless possibilities. However, you know, I was also restricted in my budget and how many people I could get. And this was still a very, like, people who actually run experiments know that this is kind of complicated as well. And having 9 conditions.
I understand.
Yeah. So that's the reason. But it's a very good question.
I'll follow up later.
Thank you. All right. So let me show you exactly how it worked, right? So as I said, I work with samples. I actually work with survey companies, and I pay them money to give me samples. And we can see that I got a sample of 3,319 people, and I give you their characteristics here, right? 12. And I asked everyone, all of those people who were assigned those conditions, whether they are willing to accept blood and whether they would be willing to change the policy to allow Jim to donate blood. And the big challenge, I think, with this project was to actually introduce people to what PrEP is. And I don't know how many of you actually knew what PrEP was before reading this paper or coming to this talk, right? But I do want to show you that PrEP is something that is being promoted constantly, and it is a drug that is becoming increasingly popular. These are all pictures that I actually took in San Francisco or in DC of a PrEP advertisement, okay? And like in public spaces. Actually, every day on my way to work, there is an advertisement or like a sign that I pass by that is promoting PrEP. So it makes me smile every time I go to work. But still, I do think that there is an issue here, and the issue is that PrEP might not be as familiar to the public. And I think that's a big issue. Yes, and someone, you know, also reminded me that there's a lot of commercials for PrEP on TV, and some people might be familiar with that from TV. But still, I think there were a lot of people who were skeptical about people's familiarity with PrEP and whether they understand what PrEP really does. And I think that was the main challenge with this project. A caveat, like just a side note, because I have the time, most of my research that deals with those issues actually deals with everyday experiences of people with health or disability. So I have other papers about parking lots and Disneyland lines and service animals, right? And learning disabilities and things that people encounter in their everyday life. PrEP is not one of those issues. And that's why it's very, very important for me to consider the external validity of this project and make sure that people actually understand what PrEP was. And I took a few measures in order to hopefully convince you that that is the case. So what I did was, in the beginning of my survey, right, because I distribute my experiment over a survey, right, online, I introduced PrEP to my participants. And the way I did that is by describing the medication. I have to say that before doing that, I actually tried a few different type of explanations on a fewer smaller samples on Amazon Mechanical Turk, which is an easier way to get survey respondents. And I checked which one worked the best in terms of understanding what PrEP was, okay? And this is what I came up with. So what I said to people is PrEP is a medication that prevents people from getting HIV. PrEP is approved by the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, and has been shown to be safe and effective. Studies around the world have shown PrEP is 99% effective in preventing HIV. A single pill taken once daily virtually eliminates the risk of getting HIV. And then I asked my participants, have you heard about PrEP before? Yes or no? And right after that, I asked them a question that is a very easy question. Okay, and this is exactly how it appeared for participants. Based on what you just read, please state if the next statement is true or false. PrEP virtually eliminates the risk of getting HIV. And if you look at your screen, I actually have the answer bolded for you right before that, right? So all you need to do is to say, this is true. If you read my paper, you know that 30% of my population failed this comprehension check. 30% failed it. 30% said this is false. It is not true. And this is very surprising to a lot of people. I have a footnote about it, and I kind of want to talk a little bit about it because I think it gives us a lot of something to ponder about. So I actually have a theory about this, and I just want to say that my theory is based somewhat on the data and somewhat not on the data. Okay, so I also asked people later to give me some of their responses about what really, what concerns they have about Jim donating blood, right? And a lot of them wrote a lot of things, and there were many answers to that. This is not, those answers can, bring a little light on this issue. What I think is that people just didn't want to believe that we have a medication, that we have, a treatment that prevents people from getting HIV. It's kind of like a situation where people were like, what? Did we cure HIV prevention? We found a solution for HIV prevention and nobody told me this? Like that must be false. It must be false. And I think that's the reason that I got so many people answering falsely to this statement. It was a big surprise for me, especially after trying it out in pre-test before. But nonetheless, what I did is I took those out of the sample, right? But I also ran my analysis with those people in my sample, and in both conditions, with the people who didn't pass the comprehension check and people who did pass the comprehension check, I got the same results that I will show you in a minute. Okay. And these are the vignettes that the participants were shown, just to make sure that you understand. So everybody got the same beginning. Everybody got the Food and Drug Administration does not accept blood donation from men who have sex with men. In the year prior to the donation, when I ran this experiment, that was the policy. Blood banks always test blood donations for contamination. And then here we see the 5 conditions of Jim on PrEP, right? So in all of those conditions, Jim is either a gay married father, a gay married man, a gay single man, or a gay single father, and also it can be a straight man. For straight men, I did not present the blood bank because it didn't actually make sense to show people that MSM cannot accept blood because it's a straight man. But I did ensure people that the blood banks test blood donations for contamination. I want to read you one of those just randomly. Jim is in his early 30s. He's a gay married man. Every day for the last 2 years, Jim and his husband have been taking PrEP, the drug that prevents people from getting HIV. Jim is a universal donor, meaning his blood type is compatible with all other types. Okay, and you can see that it's the same type of vignette. The only thing I change is what is bolded, his familial status. Okay, the familial status was not bolded for participants originally. Okay, and these are the conditions for Jim not being on PrEP. You can see that it's the same beginning about the blood bank itself. And then let's just read the one that I read you without PrEP. Jim is in his early 30s. He's a gay married man. Jim is a universal donor, meaning his blood type is compatible with all other blood types. That's it, right? That's the vignette. And then people were asked two questions. Everybody got assigned randomly, right? I assigned it randomly. That's what makes it an experiment. And I asked people in a medical situation, would you accept a blood transfusion if you knew Jim was the donor? From 1 to 5. And I asked, should the FDA policy allow Jim to donate blood? Okay, whether you would change the policy to allow Jim to donate blood. And that was tested on a 1 to 4 scale. Okay, and I think I talked to you a lot about the methodology because I wanted you to really get a good hold of it, but let's see the results. So the findings are very, very similar to those two questions on the individual level, the willingness to accept blood, and on the policy level. In both of those situations, there were statistically significant differences between gay men who were Jim as a gay man on PrEP or not on PrEP, and Jim as a straight man always on PrEP. And what was really interesting is that all the participants preferred accepting blood or to change the policy to allow the donor who is not on PrEP. They prefer the donor who is not on PrEP over the donor who is on PrEP. Okay, I'm going to say it again. The participants preferred donors, gay donors who were not on PrEP to gay donors who are on PrEP. And that is kind of irrational, right? Because we just said right in the beginning that people who do take PrEP are less likely to have HIV, right? Much less likely to have HIV. They're actually much more likely to know what their status is, right? And because they're getting checked, they're getting tested every 3 months, whereas other people who are not on PrEP might not have that information. So what we're doing here is we're actually penalizing prevention in some way. We're penalizing the person who is taking PrEP, and we prefer the person who's not taking PrEP. I just want to say something about this idea about blood donation and penalty, because I had those questions before. People say to me, okay, giving blood is not a right. I don't understand what you want. You know, like nobody said that you have to give blood. It's not written in any state law. It's not written in any constitution, right? And that is absolutely correct. However, research that has shown that people who cannot donate blood do have much less feelings of involvement in the community. They feel much less accepted as equal citizens. They see themselves as a grade B citizens and second-grade citizens, etc. So giving blood is a really important issue for a lot of people. Also, the way we talk about blood as giving a gift, there's a big important book called The Gift Relationship about giving blood. And the whole narrative about giving blood is really about citizenship and civic duty in some way. And I think this idea of inclusion is very, very important for LGBTQ people. What is even more interesting about this finding is that people always preferred the straight person on PrEP. No question about that. So they prefer the straight person on PrEP over any gay person. But within the gay people, they put the possible donors, they always preferred the gay men not taking PrEP. And this is a really interesting thing, right? It made me think of a lot of possible issues here. And what I really wanted to do is really try to think about what are the reasons for that. And there are some statistical tools that help me do that. And I'll talk about those. I'll talk about those now, actually. So one of the two things that I thought were really going into people's minds were ideas of promiscuity and maybe a misunderstanding of what PrEP is, right? Because I was always daunted by this idea that I'm giving people, this information about PrEP and they might not understand what it is. They might think that Jim is positive. He's not negative. Although I ran this comprehension check, right? And although I sorted it out, right? And I lost 30% of my sample, damn it, right? I still was really, really, really afraid of this. And what I did is I did ask people about their perceptions about Jim after the vignette. And I'm just going to tell you that what I found was a suppression effect of, and a suppression effect I'll explain in a sec. So what I found is that people actually understood that Jim, who is taking PrEP, the person who's taking PrEP, is less likely to have HIV or STIs. He is less likely to have HIV or STIs. And that has a suppression effect on their decision on whether to take blood from him or not, meaning it weakens their decision on whether to take blood from him or not. But it doesn't weaken it enough to be able to say that they prefer blood from someone on PrEP. So even though people understand that PrEP is very effective and that the donor does not have HIV or STIs, less likely to have those, they still don't want his blood. And I thought to myself, wow, this is really interesting, right? Because now it's not really about your risk of health, right? It's about something else. And what is this something else? This something else is this idea about stigma and risk compensation. So now I want to kind of open up, this discussion about, what happened with PrEP in the gay community and in some circles of the medical community when it came out. So when PrEP came out and was approved by the FDA, and later in 2014 was endorsed by the CDC, there was a lot of discussion about risk compensation. And this idea of risk compensation is that once people understand that they will have much less of a risk, they will change their risk behavior, the tendency of their risky behaviors. Meaning in PrEP is that this is a sexually charged risk compensation, that people who will take PrEP will have many more sexual partners. There's going to be a sexual anarchy, right? They will have many more sexual partners, and they will lose any use of condoms. Any person who will take PrEP will not be using condoms anymore. And that was really discussion that really went around some circles, medical circles. And what is even more surprising is this idea that it really actually penetrated the gay community and the LGBTQ community, and there came a lot of stigma around what we know as the Truvada horse, which is a term that was actually reclaimed, as we see in the picture here, by some members of the gay community. What is really interesting about this risk compensation and this idea that people who take PrEP are more promiscuous, and that PrEP will actually allow them to get into more risky behavior, is not founded. So we don't have any research and any data that actually supports this. And all the discussions that were in the FDA and within the LGBTQ community were just based on people's sense of what people might or might not do. I'm going to say another thing about this because this is an important point. The whole idea of the CDC endorsing PrEP came after a big report that came out in 2013, and that report showed much less use of condoms within the LGBT and gay community specifically. And after PrEP, we are not sure if there is less use of condoms among gay men. We don't know if this is a consequence of PrEP use or if it's just something that we already knew is happening before PrEP was in the picture, right? Before by the study from 2013 that actually had data from 25 to 2011. So we never know. There's really a very weak link between this risk compensation as an idea and what really is happening in reality. And what I call this phenomenon is the medicalization of PrEP, meaning instead of focusing on the public health benefits of PrEP, such as eradicating HIV, such as actually having more people maybe being able to donate blood safely and increasing our blood supply, which is dire during COVID and even before that, What we're focusing on is people's ideas about risk that are actually unfounded. And that leads into irrational health decisions. So the health decisions that people make about their health are colored by all those perceptions they have about a person's sexual nature or sexual behavior that might actually not even exist. And I'm just going to say, there is also research showing that even without condom use, PrEP is still more than 99% effective in preventing HIV. So, all of those just to come to show that there really isn't a health-related issue here. It's something else. And the other thing that I talk about in the paper is this idea about the expressive function of the law. And what I tried to show in this slide is to show you that on the one hand, law reflects all kinds of norms and kind of distorts them somewhat. And on the other hand, it actually builds those ideas about society. So it works both ways. And a lot of people wrote about the expressive function of the law and how it really constructs identity and how it really makes us think about certain activities. And Lawrence versus Texas is a great example if you talk about LGBTQ phenomenon, right? And the anti-sodomy laws. And I really wanted to talk about that with regard to the blood ban. And I think my findings talk about that, but it also has a caveat. So here, what we saw is that people always prefer the straight man on PrEP, right? So maybe it's not about PrEP, maybe it's about gay sex, right? Maybe because, we always prefer the straight guy and we don't care that he's taking PrEP, right? I just want to say that is a finding, and it is something that I think is very, very important to state, and it is showing something about how law constructs gay identity. However, there is a caveat here. In order to really say whether we do have something about preferring straight people on PrEP to gay people on PrEP, we need to have another experiment that will not have this idea about the blood ban presented to participants, because the penalty, this PrEP penalty that I talked about in the paper, might come not only from the expressive function of the law and animosity against gay sex, it might come from compliance with the law, right? And I actually show in the paper, where I control other variables that I can talk to about in Q&A, how compliance really speak to that. So I just want to say, I think it's always important to talk about your finding in a fair way and not to overclaim. And I think that's one of the main challenges I think people who do empirical research in law do, because I think when you don't have data, you can just say whatever you want, right? When you have data, you really cannot, right, overclaim things, and that's something that I think is very, very important. I think, I go back and forth in the paper. I want to show another part of the finding before I end, because I think I don't want to go over time. But this is a really important finding that I also found out, and that has to do with the familial status of the person. So this is really interesting because the familial status, remember we talked about how Jim can be single parent, married with children. And I want to say that I actually did find statistically significant results with regard to family status, but only when I asked people about their personal willingness to accept a blood donation. That's actually good news if you think about it, because people actually were doing a different type of risk compensation or risk calculation when they were talking about themselves versus where they were talking about changing policy. And what I think went through people's mind is like, well, on the individual level, I care about his familial status, but on a structural level, of changing the policy, I might not, right? So I only got these results when I analyzed the willingness to accept blood, not about changing the policy. And what I do is I really slice the data in a different way by the family status, and that's what you see here. And what we can see in this graph is that if you look at single or married, there is no statistically significant difference between the willingness to accept blood from a person who is single or married, who's on PrEP or not on PrEP. Meaning there is a PrEP penalty On average, if you slice the data, generally without looking on familial status, people will always want the blood from a person not on PrEP. However, if you slice it by familial status, the familial status of the donor only matters in two conditions. If the donor is a father, and we can see it's if he's a single father or a married father. In both of those conditions, people always preferred blood from a father, a gay father who's not on PrEP versus a gay father who is taking PrEP. So the PrEP penalty really works within gay fathers. Okay, so being a gay father, in other words, is another element that people take in mind when deciding to penalize people who take PrEP with regard to blood donations. And that really made me think a lot about what we think about gay fathers these days, right? And this is People magazine from 2019 and 2020. Showing us celebrity Andy Cohen and Anderson Cooper with their babies. Both of them are single gay fathers, right? That actually, became single gay fathers by choice using surrogacy, and these are a new breed, right? There was a new, a big New York Times article about it. There's a few research going on about gay fathers like that, and who really are changing the way we think about gay fathers. Really changes a lot of the stereotypes we have about gay fathers being very promiscuous, not being really a father figure, etc. And to me, what is really interesting about this research is it really connects to previous research as well. It connects to previous research about family, a gay family in general, about how in front of the Supreme Court in the Obergefell decision, in the Windsor decision, in other LGBTQ decisions, the people who were brought in front, the plaintiff, were always desexualized. This idea about gay sex or LGBTQ, or there were also like lesbian couples, the idea of sexuality was really stripped away from them. There's a lot of research on that. And specifically with gay fathers, there's a really important research by Suzanne Kim from 2012 talking about the sexually salient father. And that, or the sexual salient parent, actually. And that research really talks about custody cases and how courts really looked at parents and tried to assess whether the parents were sexually active or not, and actually penalized parents that they thought were sexually active. Specifically, they penalized people who were LGBTQ. And I thought what was really interesting is that my research really comes and makes a big intervention in another field, another type of research that is completely theoretical, and really showcases empirically how gay fatherhood is a category of its own and how it has stigma of its own that really extends beyond this idea about Suzanne Kim's analysis of custody cases. What I suggest to do as a normative way forward is basically to allow gay men on PrEP to give blood. This is going to be a win-win in terms of both increasing our blood supply that as I said, is really at a problem at this moment, and it will also normalize PrEP use through this expressive function of the law. And I think it will be a win-win in that aspect. I do want to say that I do think that that should be only the first step. And in the second step, I think the blood ban should be abolished as a whole. I do speak in the paper about other countries around the world who abolished the blood ban and used different type of methods to be able to allow gay men to donate blood, or MSM to donate blood. And I think that should be the goal at the end. And I really do hope that you enjoyed this, that you learned something from it. And I'm looking forward to hearing your questions. I'm happy to answer anything. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And I've got some questions from asynchronous folks, but I'd like to invite people who are here to start out with questions. John.
So, My question is as follows, and it's a minor question. I very much like your paper and agree with its conclusion, but I noticed that you had 2 slides earlier. In each case, it indicated a percentage of the risk percentage of contracting HIV while on the drug, while on the pill. One said 90 and the other said 92. And then you said 99. And the reason I thought that was an interesting question is that suppose I were really risk averse. I might say 90, well, do I really want to do that or not? And then it made me think about the general notion of what other risk you might have in receiving blood, is a straight guy but sleeps around or something like that. I don't know, with takes great risks. So I was wondering to what extent truth in lending or truth in giving blood becomes an issue, particularly for people who are, say, risk averse or risk acceptant.
Yeah, that's really a good question. Thank you. So I just want to say, my participants didn't see 3 slides. They only saw 1 slide, and that slide said 99. And the right number is 99. And I probably should revise my slide and take away that graphic that says 90, because it is 99. There is a lot of research that actually shows that. However, John, you have a very, very good point. Even with 99%, there's still 1%, right? And I just want to tell you, I always, as I said, there is some qualitative data that I have from participants in this study, where I asked people, so after giving them the vignette and after they answered my questions, what are your concerns? What are you afraid of? What is, what really bothers you about letting Jim donate blood? And what people said, there were quite a few people saying, what really bothers us is this idea that we have 1% chance of getting HIV. Now that is not correct, right? Because it's not a 1%, right? It's him might contract HIV, and then there's all the testing going on in the system, right? So the percentage is very, very, very slim. It's much less than 1%. But you are correct that people did have that reaction. And I want to say something about that as a researcher, as someone who wants to be fair with their participants. I wanted to provide percentage to my participants because I thought that was the right thing to do. And that is what is actually needed to be done, to give full information, right? I could just tell them, it eliminates the idea of HIV, but I wanted to be fair. I think in health, there's no 100% ever, right? It's always, the percentages are always very, very close to 100%, but they're never 100%. And that was like a calculated risk that I took with this research that I, I think I tried to put in the article a few people who really were concerned about this 1%. So it's a very, very good point.
So there's a question from Tennille Brown. Did you gather any other dependent variables like gender bias, sexism, any other kinds of scales? Or did you, in the qualitative data, see anything that looked like that?
Yeah, that's great. That's a great question. Yes, I did. So, so if you were a person who knew an LGBTQ person, you were more likely to accept blood donation from a gay man, whether on PrEP or not on PrEP. So that was a one thing. Also, there was this idea about supporting gay lifestyle. So I also gathered information from a scale that I took from a scale about this idea about whether you think that gay men should be allowed to be married, should they allowed to have sex, and that was like a scale about like support of gay men. As more support of gay men means more likely that you will be less likely to have a PrEP penalty, more likely that you will accept a blood donation from a person on PrEP, and also not on PrEP. So there were those. Interestingly, gender did not play a statistically significant difference in this research. As I said, I have other research on perceptions of disability cons and perceptions of fraud with regard to disability. They're actually consecutively around all the research. I ran, I think, 4 experiments on this, and I reran them a few times. all the time, women were always less suspicious of disability fraud. Here, it didn't happen. Yeah, so that's a really, really good question.
For people who may not be familiar, disability con means pretending or in some way taking advantage, like pretending that you need a service animal on an airplane in order to bring your pet.
Yes.
Is a pretty standard
Right.
example. Yeah.
Yes, which I have a paper on coming up in University of Illinois Law Review in August. Yes, so I wrote a whole series of paper on perceptions of people abusing the law. So yeah, read my other scholarship too.
Blake, you have a question.
Yeah. First, great presentation. I learned a lot. So I actually have two questions. The first one, I just wanted to add on or elaborate a little bit on what John had asked about. So you referenced a percentage of the probability of contracting HIV when someone is on PrEP. Is there any data, I'm sure there is, or research out there to show the probability of a blood test or screen not catching a disease or illness that the donor might have? That's my first question.
1 to 4.147 million.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's what it is. Yeah. It used to be before the technology really developed for blood screening. It used to be 1 to 2,000 in the 80s. It's
Okay.
now 1 to 4.147 million.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess my second question just kind of builds off of that. I think, before I saw this presentation today, if given a survey like that, my gut perception and reaction would be, well, if I don't have to take a risk in contracting something like HIV through a blood transfer, I'd rather not do that.
Mm.
The numbers obviously show that the chance of that happening is minuscule. And so it seems like, really the problem to solve for is perception. And I'm just curious, apart from the research and the writing and everything that you're doing, what other types of activities or efforts are you making to change that perception? Because I think at the end of the day, I mean, maybe, obviously to some extent there's people who are biased, but I think for a lot of people, it's just risk adverse people trying to avoid, contracting some sort of illness. And so how, moving forward, how are you thinking about changing that perception on a wider scale?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I do think that, I think you're absolutely right. I think, not every, and I'm very, very careful in the paper, and I'm not pointing fingers, right? And I think that's very, very important, not to point fingers and say, oh, you're such a homophobe, right? Because I have to say, and I have to say, I did have a lot of homophobic comments, but I had a lot of other comments, right, that were not homophobic at all, right? So it's very, very important. So, I think a lot of people are really used to the use of the word bias, right? If you notice, I haven't used the word bias once in my and if you do Control F for my paper, you won't find the word bias even once. So I think it's a lot of lack of information, and I do think that I think that after people hear me talk and hopefully read this paper, and I do hope to make it into an op-ed and talk a little bit about it outside of the academic audience, I do think people might change their opinion on PrEP, and they might just not, right? So as I told you, there was a lot of there's a lot of campaigns around PrEP, right? And I just told you, I live in Syracuse, and every day I go to work, and every day I pass that sign, right? And there's all those TV infos that I'm sure that from now on, Blake, you will notice those, right? And let's look at the messages that they sent. And I can tell you that there is research about what messages they sent, right? And they're really trying to show different faces of people on PrEP, but I think it's a hard battle. I'm just going to tell you another secret. My next project is called Penalizing Prevention. Penalizing Prevention. And it really shows that this idea about preventative measures is not limited to PrEP. It's something that happens with a lot of preventative measures. You can talk about the HPV vaccine for women, and how some conservative circuits didn't want to give it to their daughters because they thought that will give them a license to promiscuity. right? Or you can think about it outside of the sexual realm. You can think about people who use methadone or other types of preventative measures to make them not relapse to drugs. You can think about people who used to have mental health treatment as a prevention and take the bar today. And what does that signal to our profession when someone is disqualified? So that's my next paper, right? So we'll have to wait for that. But I do think there is a lot to do about, fighting that type of stigma. And I think it's not going to be an easy way to do. I'm just going to say, I do think that if we change the policy to allow people on PrEP to donate, I think it will make news and it will actually make people maybe more believe in PrEP and maybe normalize it.
So there's a comment and also a question that I got from somebody taking it asynchronously that I think linked together. And I'll read Peter's comment, but invite him to say more if he wants. He says, I think one thing to note is that PrEP is not only for MSM or LGBTQ population. Everyone who has multiple sexual partners would be great candidates for PrEP. And the other question, the discussion provides examples of people basing their negative opinions on unsupported beliefs that PrEP users are largely promiscuous, even when the hypothetical PrEP users are in a monogamous relationship. This questioner says, maybe it is a little odd if you're in a monogamous relationship to be taking PrEP. And maybe the implication is concern that either the partner has HIV or that one of the partners can't be assumed to be monogamous.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
these are just both about promiscuity biases.
Yeah, that's great. So I think that's a fair assumption, and I actually bring people who talk about that in the paper. That's not a finding, right? It's a presumption that a person makes about a person who takes PrEP. Maybe they have multiple partners. Maybe they have an open marriage, right? I know the word monogamous does not appear in my vignette. That's something that people might assume or might not assume about people, and people did not assume about married couple, and yet there was no statistically significant difference with regard to PrEP use for married people, right? So I just want to say that was not a finding. It did come up a few times, but it's not, a finding that I could point to, right? I do think that this assumption about open marriage is something that was made by some people, but I'm just also going to say, it is, I don't know what stance anyone has about open marriage and open relationships, right? There's a great paper by Liz Emmons about this from 2004, compulsory monogamy, I think it's called, and I do cite it. I do think, this idea about these ideas that we have about, or judgments that we have about open relationships, maybe should not influence the way we make decisions about our health, right? Because those people who actually are in non-monogamous relationship, who are taking PrEP, are people who taking care of themselves, and their chances of getting HIV are slim, or even non-existent in a lot of ways. So I do think that this idea only shows how this idea about morality, and I'm not saying, that open relationship is the best thing or is a bad thing. It's a good thing or a bad thing. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that it might not be related to how you're making a decision about your health, and you actually might be making an irrational decision by allowing a person not on PrEP to not donate blood. But I think it's a really, really fair comment. And I think that's also a very, very fair comment about your first comment about other people who might be eligible for PrEP, and that's absolutely correct.
So I noticed that Jim Rubel's got a comment in the chat also about other people potentially eligible for PrEP, IV drug users.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I'd invite a little more discussion of whether there are other possible risks floating around here, like Hep C, that I don't know whether people would even know about that, but I take it Truvada doesn't. It's only an HIV prophylaxis, or maybe I'm wrong about that too, because I don't know the biology.
Yeah, so Truvada is only an HIV prophylaxis, okay? It only prevents HIV. However, people who are on PrEP are being tested for all STIs every 3 months. So the chances, in order for them to be able to get another dose of Truvada. So every 3 months, 4 times a year, they're being tested for other STIs. And that decreases their chances of getting STIs when compared to other people who usually don't. And there's actually, I actually bring the numbers of people who, or gay people who are not on PrEP and actually don't get tested even once a year. So even the chances of a person on PrEP to have an STI is lower compared to a person who doesn't take PrEP. Although PrEP within of itself is not, it doesn't protect against STI. About the issue of drug users, that's absolutely correct. There's people who have multiple partners are usually people who are at risk of that. I did not have many people talk to me about drug users. I don't think there's anything in the vignette that points in that direction. So yes, that could be, a possibility in some people's minds about why they didn't want to take PrEP. I think that's, another limitation.
So there's a question from Lydia and then one from Shubha.
I just had a quick comment. Thank you so much for your speech. This was really important and timely. One comment was just how you were talking about how sometimes our emotions can dictate our medical decisions, and just a personal experience. I went to the doctor to get vaccinated for Hep C. I'm in a monogamous marriage. And so the discussion with my doctor went, are you sexually active? Yes. Are you in a monogamous relationship? Yes. Okay, you should still get this. And I was like, I don't understand. I if I don't need it, I don't need it. But he was like, okay, well, what if your husband cheats on you? What if you get raped? What if, and so to have a more well-rounded view of why I'm actually doing this to prevent things for myself, instead of just letting my emotional of like, well, I'm in a monogamous relationship, right? So I think that there are good comparisons to draw of how we often use our emotions or what we view, maybe what we think our life is, to make those sorts of medical decisions.
Thank you so much for this comment. That's a great comment. And yeah, it's what I'm going to talk about in my next paper in the penalizing prevention. I think that's such a good message. Yeah, I might email you. Yeah, and ask you a little bit more. Is that,
Yeah,
that's
okay?
Feel free to do so.
That's another great preventive example.
Yep.
Shubha.
I really enjoyed this. Thank you, Doran. Just maybe a clarifying question, may follow up from the previous question. The reality and perception, I guess, is Truvada, is PrEP, is that something that is taken voluntarily? I mean, you need a prescription, I assume, from the doctor to get it. So it's not over the counter. But is it viewed as something that's therapeutic as well as preventative? In other words, when would a doctor, so in other words, I know that a person is on a particular drug, whatever it might be. I mean, I take medicine for diabetes, I take medicine for lots of things. And I guess people may wonder, well, that means you must have that disease, or the doctor thinks you should be on that drug. I wonder how that fits into this. I'm imagining that it's like being on the pill. That's a voluntary decision. Sometimes there may be therapeutic, there are obviously therapeutic aspects for being on the pill, but I wonder about that decision and what the perception is that people have about that decision.
Yeah, that's a great question. It is a preventative measure when it's so we need to differentiate a little bit between the terms. The drug itself is called Truvada. It's also called Descovy nowadays. There's a new version of it. Okay, that's the term, like the name of the brand name of the pill. Truvada is used for PrEP pre-exposure prophylaxis, which is preventative. However, a different version of it can be used for PEP, not PrEP, PEP, which is for people who are HIV positive. And that is why, and in 2012, Truvada was approved as PrEP, as preventative. Before that, a different version of it was used for treatment, okay? That was exactly what I was really afraid that my respondents would not get, right? And that's why I never used Truvada and I used PrEP. So that is the preventative, the name of the treatment, not the name of the medication, right? The answer for that is twofold, right? So first, people only people who passed the comprehension check about what Truvada or what PrEP does were included in one analysis that I just showed you, although I did another analysis with everyone in and I got the same results. So it didn't matter. The second answer is that what I said is that I actually ran another analysis and I show that people are are likely to think that the person who takes PrEP is less likely to have the HIV or STIs. So it doesn't work like people didn't think about it as a treatment. But you're really touching on my worst nightmare with this research. And the 2017, I think, version, I don't think had the safeguards, and that's why but it still had the same results. So it's kind of depressing. Like the more you do, it doesn't really matter. Like people really don't want people on PrEP. So, but yeah, I think these are really, really good answers that I hope, I made as many safeguards as I could to make sure that people don't think it's for treatment. People understand that it's for prevention. Yeah, that's a really important comment.
So there's a comment or question from Timothy Tripp and then Ryan Jensen after that.
Mm-hmm.
Timothy.
Thank you. Good presentation. But I had to, I was looking at the chart you're presenting, and there seemed to be a prevention penalty, as you called it, where people were less likely to accept blood from those who were not taking PrEP. One thing that struck me was, before this presentation, I knew very little about PrEP. And in a vacuum, if you were to ask me, hey, do you want to accept blood from this person who is, continually taking this medication, not knowing anything about the side effects or what other effects it could have on, drug tests or anything of that nature, I would be hesitant to accept blood from that person. And so I wondered if, you factored that into your analysis at all.
Yes, I did. That's a great question. Yes. So I'll tell you, it's really interesting. And what it points out to is how important it is to run so many pre-tests on your experiments before you run it. So when I started this in 2017, I was in a group in my lab, and one person told me, I just want to tell you, I just don't like drugs. I just don't like drugs in my blood. I just don't like drugs in the blood supply. It really freaks me out. It's really not a thing. Like, I really don't want it, right? And it doesn't matter if it's an HIV prevention drug or it's any drug. I just don't like drugs, okay? And I was like, wow, that's so interesting. Let me have that in my analysis. And I don't think I have this in my slides. Or you know what? I actually think maybe I do. No, I don't. I'm sorry. But it's actually in the paper. You can look at, there is going to be a regression table with predictors. What I did is I asked people, would you allow a person who has an allergy for dust mites and who takes medication to control his allergy for dust mites, would you allow him to donate blood? Right? And that is, and I use the dust mites example because it's a very unstigmatizing condition, right? We don't really stigmatize people who are allergic to dust, right? And I controlled for it. And even when I control for it, there is still a PrEP penalty. So it is something that I took into account. It is something that I took into account. I want to say another thing that I took into account, and because you already asked, is this idea about compliance with other type of blood banks. So a person who went abroad to a country that people, who come back from that country cannot donate blood. I was wondering about people's level of compliance with FDA policies in general. And I had that inside my regression. And also, when controlling for that, there was still a PrEP penalty. So those were not issues that actually influenced people. Yeah, but it's a really, well, I think what it comes to show is that you have those perceptions of what people care about and what people don't care about, and that we are all, very, very different from each other. And I think, like John, before you said, everybody has their own, are risk averse in a different way. And I think it is very, very important to bear those in mind.
Ryan.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, so given that some people don't choose their blood donors, it's ultimately, up to the FDA to decide. What's the role in your research in kind of trying to change that and trying to change the policy?
Right. So you're absolutely right. This is all hypothetical, right? Like it's not like when I go to a hospital and I say, oh, I want my blood from Ryan, because Ryan is a really
Oh no. Hopefully Doran will be back shortly. There, it looks like no.
Oh, I'm back. Okay.
Good.
Sorry about that. I don't know where that's come from. But if you don't really care about PrEP stigma and eradicating HIV, you probably do care about the blood supply. And what I show you is that maybe people on PrEP are our answers to increase our blood supply. There's actually a great research that shows what would happen if we take down the blood ban, and we actually are going to increase our blood supply by at least 4%. So that's the prediction. So I think what my research really comes to show is that it's not research about LGBTQ people, right? It's a research that we all should care about, and it really is influencing a really important public health issue.
Yeah, I understand those issues. Getting more blood in the blood supply, and then also helping LGBTQ people feel more connected by being able to donate blood. My question also is, given your research, since the FDA ultimately has to choose that, is this kind of to help raise awareness and help kind of the general public put that more? Is that kind of your strategy with this?
Yeah, so I just want to say FDA, so we tend to think about the FDA as making decisions based on medical issues, right? It's kind of like a robot, right? It's like, oh, this is safe, this is not safe, okay, we're going to make it. This is not how the FDA works, right? And there's a lot of research that shows us that this is not how the FDA works, and that the FDA actually responds to people's ideas and to public awareness of issues and how they push it. And one example is how we changed the blood ban in April 2020 to allow a shorter abstinent or deferral period of time to 3 months instead of 12 months. Right? There's also a lot of research done on this. I'm blanking on the name, and Leslie, I'm a little embarrassed. There's a very famous professor in American University who does work on the FDA. I'll come up with his name in a second, whose whole research agenda is about this push and pull between public perceptions and FDA policies. So what I'm trying to show here is that we have an FDA policy that is irrational, that is counterintuitive in a lot of ways to a lot of people, and we can actually make it right, not only increase our blood supply, but also as a side effect, increase the normalization of PrEP in general and help eradicate HIV. So it's actually a win-win situation, right? So it's actually, what I like about this project is that it leads very, very specifically into law reform, in that area. So and something that is very, it was kind of an easy win-win in that aspect.
Yeah, that answers that question. Thanks.
Yeah, just as a follow-up, do you anticipate that the prevention more generally paper will also be in part a law reform project?
No, I don't know. I'll tell you what, that paper will not be an empirical paper. right? It will be a big theoretical paper like law reviews like, right? Like big, like we take 3 case studies and we analyze, right? So that's going to be the nature of that paper. Where it's going to lead, I'm not sure. I haven't really started choosing all the case studies. I think here it was easy, I think, because everything kind of led me, and like when I go into a project, I don't know where it's going to lead me. I don't know if I'll get results. I'm just going to tell you, when you do those type of experimental work, you get all those grants. I just had a project that failed, didn't yield any results, and all my money went, out the roof or out the window because the experiment didn't yield any results. So, there's a lot of like uncertainties with those type of research. And specifically, I think there's an uncertainty when you take on like a big project like the penalizing prevention. So I don't know if it will be as specific and it will lead like to a specific recommendation like that. It might be something a little bit broader.
So I'm not sure, Shuba, whether you've got a new question or...
I actually do have a new question. Doran, your example of the dust mites made me wonder, did you correct or check, or is this of interest to see about attitudes towards vaccination? Because I wonder if there's just some underlying notion of purity of blood. I mean, these cultural notions of the blood supply, and
right.
And if the fear is, they're taking any drug, this may tie into your prevention analysis as well, that somehow the blood is somehow not pure, whatever that might mean. I mean, when you mentioned the tetanus, the blood donation literature back in the 60s, right? Tetanus and Arrow, and a lot of that was about voluntary versus, commodified, paying for drug donation, and how actually having blood donation, blood donors being compensated might actually hurt the blood supply. Because people will be acting more opportunistically in terms of selling their blood rather than acting more voluntarily. And I don't know have you seen Kara Swanson's work?
Yes. I was just about to tell you about Kara Swanson's book.
I was just thinking about it. Yeah. When you mentioned it, and I was just thinking about just those broader issues. And it struck me when you mentioned the dust mite example that maybe there's some anti-vaxxers out there who are not completely clear about the science.
Yes. I'm just going to tell you. So I didn't ask about vaccination. No, I did not. I think it's a great, thing to do for another project to work on. I do think, there is like this underlying issue that I think I talked about with my comprehension check. Why do I think people didn't pass the comprehension check that you saw was very, very easy to pass, and still 30% like failed it. I think the issue is that people really did not trust this, did not hear about it. I don't remember who asked me about, people's ideas and knowledge. It might not be bias. It might not be lack of knowledge. I think Blake asked me about that, and I think that's very correct. And I think that might be it. I just want to say that I also have a lot of data, a lot of qualitative data of people's concern that I actually started coding, but it came out to be very, very difficult to code because people put a lot of things in one answer. And it's, there might be another paper just about people's concerns because I'm sitting on so much data, so much rich data from this project that I'm not sure even what to do with. So I think that, also follows your concern. Yeah, and I think, it's kind of endless. It can lead to other projects. The person in American University who does work on the FDA and how it corresponds with public ideas is Louis Grossman. Okay, Louis Grossman in American University. I love his work so much, and I really wanted to give him a shout out. So I don't know if Ryan is interested, at looking at that or not, but he does really interesting and wonderful work as well. There was a new op-ed that just came out, I think a few weeks ago from Holly Fernandez about how the FDA should actually respond to public concerns. I also cite that in my article as well. And I think that's a really, really important document as well, because I do think there is this perception about the FDA making decisions only with regard to like health, where it actually is much more complicated than that, I think.
Just for people here who may not know the reference, the gift relationship by Titmus is a comparative US-UK study about blood donation. he was a British sociologist who died pretty young of cancer, as I recall. But it's a wonderful book.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a very old sort of sociology of medicine classic.
Yeah, yeah. That's the good thing about being a researcher. I don't know, like I kind of love my job. I think it kind of shows, but I really like my job because you get to read all those things about other projects. When I wrote my service animal piece, I read all those biographies of people writing about their dogs. There's a genre in disability studies about people writing about their dogs and their relationship with their dogs. And I literally read like 7 books about that, and I got so excited. I was like, yes, finally I have a project that I can read all those books that I always wanted. So The Gift Relationship was the book that I always wanted to read, and I was able to read for this project. Yeah, it's really an interesting and cool book. It's from, I think, the 70s or something, right? Or from
maybe even earlier.
Yeah. It's a really great book.
But it's also a kind of illustration of solidarity. I mean, as I remember, he talks about the World War II, this is why I think it's even older, the World War II generation in the UK who just thought everybody gives blood as a matter of duty. Yeah.
It is civic duty. Yes, and because I have to tell you, like, I actually, I got that, I spread around, I gave this piece to other people to read, and I think there's a lot, I think I'm just also going to say this is a very hot button issue, right? Like, can I take more hot button issues than gay sex and blood donations, right? I'm taking medications, like, I don't think there's a lot more that I could do to make it even more, I guess hard, or make it a hard decision. And I do think that like those issues also came up, and I think a lot of people who read my work or earlier draft asked me to a little unfold this issue about the civic duty and this idea about how people feel about being able to give blood or not. I have actually, well, we have like 2 more minutes. I have a personal story about it. When I came out of the closet, I am a son of an army person who makes a rule of like donating blood a few times a year. And when I came out of the closet, the first thing my dad asked me is like, wow, so we won't be able to give blood anymore, huh? And that's what really bothers my dad. And I thought to myself, wow, that's such an interesting thing to say. It didn't make it into the paper, but now you hear it. And I think that was one, and it stayed with me for many, many, many years. And probably, I think there's an intimate element to all the work that I do. And people are always surprised by how intimate my work is. And I think this is the first paper, or like one of the first, that really has like some kind of like a personal element to it as well.
It starts with a lovely anecdote about the person who couldn't give monoclonal antibodies to save people in COVID too. Right. So Erica George made just a comment about so much more to say about clean blood in the chat. But I'll invite you, we're now at 4:45, so we're at the formal end of this, but if you like to take just another, or maybe that's just a great note to end on what you just said, so.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you everyone for coming. This was really, really, really fun. I really enjoyed myself. Thank you for the great questions and comments. I learned a lot from you guys too.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
It's absolutely terrific. And I apologize if I missed any hands, but I do actually, the hands I see are saying thank you. So thank you so much, and hopefully we'll see many of you next week.